Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about how we can test linear speed for athletes. So first we need to establish what linear speed is, and essentially what we're talking about is running speed in a straight line. And this can be measured over various distances, although the distances that we measure are going to be dependent on the athletes that we're testing and the athlete populations. And more specifically, it's going to be dependent on what sport they play. So for example, if we have a basketball player versus a rugby player, a basketball player is never really going to run more than 30 meters in a game, since the court is less than 30 meters, which means that measuring distances greater than 30 meters is probably not going to be very applicable to a basketball player. Whereas a rugby player, they have a field of 100 meters in length, which means that they're likely to run much greater distances throughout the game, and higher speeds are probably going to be more applicable and appropriate and important for an athlete who plays rugby. So it's going to be dependent on the athlete, what sport they play, and what distances they typically cover in their sport. So in terms of the test selection, what test are we going to use to measure linear speed? Obviously, we're going to use a straight line sprint, so that's pretty obvious, but what is not obvious is the method, the timing method we're going to use, and then the distance that we're going to cover. So, as a rule of thumb, we have distances of about 5 to 15 meters that we're going to measure, which is going to be measuring acceleration. Distances of around 15 to 50 meters is going to measure maximum speed or maximum velocity running, and then distances of greater than 50 meters is going to be measuring maximum speed endurance. So depending on what the athlete requires in their sport and what's most appropriate, we would choose distances of 0 to one of these sort of categories. And what method we're going to use is going to be dependent on what equipment we have and how long we need. So the best, most and fastest method is going to be using electronic gates, where we basically just have gates set up and they can run through and it gives you an automatic time. Easy to record, fast, and the most accurate. However, if you don't have access to electronic timing gates, then you can use a stopwatch, or you can also use video. So a stopwatch is pretty simple. A coach or a training partner will just start and stop it as the athlete starts and finishes. However, the issue here is that a stopwatch is not very accurate. Reaction times in humans are somewhere around 0.2 seconds, which means that 0.2 seconds plus or minus on a sprint is quite a big deal. So if you get that improvement, that is actually quite a good improvement, and it's just from reaction time. So there's a lot of error involved with the stopwatch. So maybe appropriate for younger and less developed athletes, but for more advanced athletes, it's probably not that appropriate. Video is actually going to be quite a good method here. The only issue is that it's quite time consuming. So what you can do is you can film an athlete sprinting a certain distances that you can mark, and by videoing that, you can then review it, and you can start on a phone or on a computer, you can have a look at the time that the athlete starts their run, and then have a look at the time that they finish their run. So when they're exactly past them, when they just passed the marker, and if you subtract the first time, their starting time from their finishing time, you should get a pretty accurate result of how fast they ran the distance. So that's actually quite an accurate method. However, it's much more time consuming, and it's probably not going to be very appropriate to do for a whole team if you need to test a whole team. So going back to the distances we're covering and these different qualities, what we can do is we can actually, if you have access to multiple electronic timing gates, you can basically have multiple gates in a row at different distances, and you can actually measure all three qualities in the one sprint. So if you get someone to sprint maximally through, let's say, 30 meters, for example, we can measure the 5 meter time, so from the start to 5 meters. We can then measure the 15 meter time, and also the 30-meter time. And you could do this for any arrangement of distances as well. And what you'll also get usually with most timing gates is you'll get a flying time. So you'll also be able to get 15 meters to 30 meters, so that flying sprint time, which is also going to be another good measure of maximum speed. So you can potentially measure all three qualities in one, if that's important to the sport, just through one smart setup if you have access to the appropriate equipment. So there's a few important considerations when we're actually performing the linear speed tests. So we've got to make sure that we measure the distances of the markers or of the gates as accurately as possible so that it's consistent. Because even if we're half a meter to a meter off, it's going to actually have quite a decent impact on speed. Since speed is timed in tenths of seconds, it's actually going to be really important that the distances are exact and 100% accurate every single time, so that we have reliability and validity. Also, another thing that's important is to make sure we have a consistent starting position. So for example, if we're using timing gates, since you can't start right on the timing gate, because if you break the beam it'll start, we might say have the front foot 20 centimeters before the first gate. So that way you can have a marker there, have their front foot 20 centimeters before, so every athlete that goes through that test, and every time the athletes redo the test, it's consistent every single time. So make sure you have a consistent starting position regardless of what method you use, whether that's a foot placement, whether that's a hand placement, or whatever it is. It has to be consistent every time. The last thing is that we need to put 100% effort into sprints, which means you need to give them a good amount of rest and make that consistent between attempts. So let's say they might have 5 minutes rest between each attempt in order to give 100% effort. And don't slow down until after the last marker. A really important one. You see this all the time, especially younger athletes. They start slowing down 2-3 meters before they've passed the last gate or the last marker, which is going to influence their time. So you really encourage the athletes to make sure they don't slow down until they've passed the last marker. So you might even put an extra marker past the first one, a few meters in front, and tell them to run through there to ensure that they actually get past the last marker without slowing down. So also another thing to make sure they do this, have plenty of room after the last marker, so they're not scared of not slowing down in time. So have plenty of room so they have plenty of time to slow down and can therefore run 100% through the entire lane. So that's it for this presentation, guys. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of it. If you're a curious individual who's interested in learning more about sports performance training, you can find Flow High Performance on Facebook and on Instagram. On these platforms, you'll find hundreds of these research infographics, which are the latest research summarized into these easy to understand pictures, so that you can stay up to date with the latest research without actually having to go into the journal yourself and reading the entire article.